Scientifically based research and knowledge about diseases needs to be communicated with the general public consistently and persistently. This needs to be done in ways that are understandable and reliable. Throughout the world, there are organizations and institutions that are specifically designed to do this work. But what do we know about them? And why do we need to know about them? In this special episode of the book series, I called the founding executive director of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases in South Africa and emeritus professor of virology at the University of the Witwatersrand. His new book, Fighting an Invisible Enemy, the story of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, was published by Wits University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. We spoke earlier this morning. Dr. Barry Schoub, thank you so much for making the time. I'm very happy to have you today.
Thank you very much, Anotida. Thank you for the invitation.
That's awesome. I want to know your story. I know your story and the story of the NICD are not so different stories, because we can't talk of NICD without mentioning you. Neither can we talk about you without mentioning NICD.
Yeah, well, my name is Barry Schoub, as you mentioned earlier. I'm a medically qualified virologist. In other words, I have an MD in medicine, specialist virologist, and I've got a doctorate in science in virology. So that's my background. I am now what's called the emeritus professor of virology. In other words, I was the professor of virology, for 33 years at the University of Witwatersrand. From 2000 from 2001 to 2010, so the 33 years of it. During that time, I was an undergrad. I taught undergraduate virology to the health sciences, medicine, dentistry, other health professionals, also postgraduate qualifications, and also a number of doctoral theses. So I had quite a very fruitful academic career, stretching over a number of years, a couple of decades, in fact. But I guess my main hat that I wore was that I was the founding director of the NICD, the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Prior to that, I was a director of the National Institute for Virology, which I'll talk about maybe a bit later, which was one of the ancestral institutes which gave rise to the NICD. I retired in 2011, and since then I've had various managerial positions. I chaired the board of the National Health Laboratory Services, which is all the public laboratories in the country. I was also the chair of the Advisory Committee on COVID vaccines for South Africa for a few years. And now I'm in blissful retirement, which enabled me to write the book.
Nice.
Why I wrote the book was I was actually in a way goaded to write the book by the former director of the South African Institute for Medical Research, which is a much larger institute. He wrote a book on that history, and he said, "Look, it behooves me to write a book on the NICD, so it will be a historical document, so people can kind of look back. How did it come about?" And it'll be something that can be on the bookshelves and give value to people who read it.
I like it. I like that you emphasize that it is a historical manuscript. So viewers and listeners, you must know that this is a book that you can read. You don't necessarily need to be a medical doctor or a health professional to read this book, but it's a historical manuscript. So it will enable you to know how the NICD was founded and its story from the moment it was started up until now. So, Dr. Schoub, I'm going to give you the time. What would you say are the core ideas of the book? What main ideas do you address as you tell the story of the NICD?
So let me just start off by explaining the title itself, because I think that encompasses what the core ideas of the book are. When we talk about communicable, maybe is not a term that many people are totally familiar with. What do I mean by communicable is infectious diseases. And in fact, communicable and infectious are really synonyms. So I'm going to use these two terms interchangeably. I'll mainly use infectious diseases because I think most people are kind of understand it more, understand that term better. And, since antiquity, since way back, centuries ago, people were always in awe of infectious diseases. They treated, obviously, many, many centuries ago with a lot of suspicion, a lot of superstition. There's a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of fear. We think of the great plagues of antiquity. And then, of course, a lot of it has been now overcome, and we're talking now into the 20th century. And then we had a lot of complacency. And more recently, we've had new diseases coming onto the scene. You talked about COVID, and COVID is certainly one of these new diseases which only arose at the end of 2019, and of course is still with us. We talk about the viral hemorrhagic fevers, these formidable, fearsome diseases, which are new diseases. So that's now replaced that fear that we had in antiquity. So I think the core idea, the main kind of thrust of the book, is to explain what these diseases are.
Okay.
In lay terms, because this is really a book which is for general audiences. It's not for specialist audiences. So I explained in lay terms what these diseases are and how a public health institute is established to actually deal with them, to kind of respond to them, to control them. So it's really a kind of communication tool between a public health institute dealing with something which is very much on people's minds and trying to explain to them what's really behind the diseases and what's behind the mechanism to control them.
This is something you started, is it 2000 or 2002?
The NICD itself started in 2001 and was actually born in 2002.
Okay, that's great.
The idea started in 1995.
Interesting.
With a letter that I wrote to the authorities suggesting that we establish an institute called the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. So
Wonderful.
it took 5 years or 6 years for the baby to be born.
Wonderful. Take me through that process. When the idea was born and when the institute was born, what was going on between these years?
Actual seeds of the organization really started at the turn of the 20th century. Way back then, 1905, 1910. And that started with the South African Institute for Medical Research. That was the big organization which looked at all diseases, infectious and non-infectious diseases. And like the CDC in the United States, it started with a single disease. Now, the mining industry, the mines, particularly the gold mines, as you may know, is a major industry in South Africa. And one of the main health problems was pneumonia amongst the mining personnel. So the government approached various doctors, various scientists, and said, look, we need to set up an institute which can look at pneumonia, just that one disease, pneumonia. So they collected funds from the industry and from the government, and they then set up I think they opened their doors in 1905, but really started operating in 1910 to research pneumonia and develop a vaccine. And of course, from then it expanded more and more and more to encompass all diseases, infectious and non-infectious diseases, and that became the South African Institute of Medical Research. That was the one ancestral institute. Then much later, fast forward to about 1940s, and there were epidemics of poliomyelitis throughout the world and also in my country, in South Africa. And they started collecting funds in South Africa as they did in the United States. You might have heard of the March of the Dimes that President Roosevelt, who's himself a polio sufferer, by the way.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Right. So he launched a fund collection called the March of the Dimes, and we had a similar one in South Africa called the March of the Tikkies. The Tikkies was a little coin similar to the dime. And they collected funds from the public to research polio and to make a polio vaccine. Now, of course, it's all old hat, but we're talking about the late 1940s. There was no vaccine then. And that became an organization, an institute called the Poliomyelitis Research Foundation, looking only at polio. once the institute was established, of course, then it started broadening out into all viral diseases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in 1976, that then became the National Institute for Virology, because the government of the day were worried about things like the viral hemorrhagic fevers, the Marburg virus, the Ebola virus, and they were also worried about biological weapons and all this kind of thing. So they set an organization called the National Institute for Virology in 1976. I was a director then, and from 1978, in fact. I wasn't the first director, but 1978. And then I got the idea in the 1990s, when we had our new democratic government coming in 1995, that we needed to set up, as part of the plan of the African National Congress, which was the government of liberation, that we would set up an institute to take the microbiology, which is the one, if you look at microbes, there are two main arms. There are the microbes, which are bacteria, fungi, and parasites on the one hand, and then we have the viruses on the other hand. To kind of the microbes were dealt with by the South African Institute of Medical Research, and the viruses by the National Institute for Virology. And I said to them, why don't we meld these two institutes together to form the National Institute for Communicable Diseases? Now, there were a lot of hurdles that we had to jump over, and that's very much illustrated in the book. This clash between academia and
Yes.
bureaucracy,
Mm-hmm.
that occupies quite a lot of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to kind of that people in generations to come realize that these institutes don't just fall out of the sky.
Yes.
It takes a lot of kind of diplomacy, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of hard work, a lot of knocking on doors, um, a lot of losing one's temper, a lot of kind of hard talk. And then we get this institute coming together.
Mm-hmm.
So it was
Mm-hmm.
the South African Institute of Medical Research with this microbiology and microbes, the National Institute for Virology with the viruses, came together to form a National Institute of Communicable Diseases, of all infectious diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it came about. It was really part of the new government, the democratic government's health plan.
Okay.
And it fitted squarely into that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the NICD came about.
Mm-hmm.
It opened its doors really the end of 2001,
Mm-hmm.
was really functioning properly from 2002. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where we are today.
Wonderful. That is so great. Thank you for giving that history. So from the time that you established up until today,
Yeah.
what can you say are the major achievements, the major highlights of the work that you have done?
Well, I think it's very, very broad based. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at the NICD itself, it's divided, it started off with those two arms, looking at the organisms themselves, the
Mm-hmm.
microbes,
Mm-hmm.
microbes and biology, but that was not practical. It was convenient at the time. But more recently, it's divided up into the actual diseases themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 7 what we call centers, like the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta in America. So we also have 7 centers dealing with the various respiratory diseases caused by microbes and viruses, gastrointestinal diseases, again, viruses and bacteria. TB has got its own one. HIV/AIDS has got its own one, and so on. Now, these centers then have done work in surveillance. A lot of research has been done, and so on. To just highlight some of them, we have one of the centers is called, or deals with viral hemorrhagic fevers and related diseases. Now, these are diseases which are caused by organisms which are very, very lethal, highly dangerous, very difficult to work with, and they have to work with them in a very highly sophisticated laboratory to protect the workers. Actually, on the cover of the book, it's got illustration of the kind of environment you work in, these like spacesuits to protect the workers and to protect people on the outside as well. These are very lethal organisms. Marburg, Ebola, Lassa, you might have heard of them. Also, these teams went out into where the outbreaks were taking place, mainly on the African continent, some of them also on the Asian continent as well. So they kind of very difficult very difficult environments that they actually worked in. And this was the only laboratory on the African continent, only what we call a BSL-4, which stands for biosafety level 4, the highest level. It goes from BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4, progressively higher levels of sophisticated containment and protection of the people that are working with them. So that was one of our big highlights of the organization. The biggest research facility is actually the HIV/AIDS. And that's not too surprising, seeing that South Africa's got the largest population in the world of people living with HIV. So this was a major research organization, and they've done very penetrating, very profound research into HIV towards hopefully eventually producing a vaccine. But at this stage, looking at resistance to the antiretroviral drugs. South Africa, by the way, is the biggest antiretroviral program in the world because we've got the biggest number of people which are living with HIV. So a lot of the research has been done in that, and that's explained very well, very in great detail in the book. And just as a historical anecdote, as a sideline, South Africa is also one of the, unfortunately, it's a bit of a sad situation. We had a period of time which stretched over a couple of years where the government of the day were anti-science. And they had an HIV denial attitude. And they refused antiretroviral therapy for quite a number of years. It was a rather sad period in our history. But I've detailed that quite extensively in the book because I think we need to kind of show the public how important it is that scientifically based information is communicated to the public. Because in dealing with all these diseases, we need buy-in from the public. We need community buy-in. That is so important. And I think it's a very colorful history that's in the book, but it's really to show a very important point. But just to come back to what you asked, yes, HIV/AIDS has produced a lot of very important research that has been published in publications. And then, of course, just coming to COVID-19.
Yes.
COVID-19, like any country in the world, just about, this was a pandemic which stunned the medical establishment. To be honest, we were not prepared for it. And that is one of the kind of deficiencies which we need to kind of learn the lesson from in preparation for the next pandemic. The medical community worldwide, in all countries in the world, were unprepared for this pandemic. We need to have early warning systems and surveillance and so on. And South Africa, of course, was just one of them as well. But one of the advantages that we did have from the AIDS research is that we had a very sophisticated way of analyzing the genome, the genetic material of the virus which caused COVID, the SARS-CoV-2. And that was important because the second variant of COVID was first identified in South Africa. That was the beta variant. The variant which we've got at the moment, Omicron, you probably heard of Omicron.
Yes,
that's the
yes,
current variant. That was first identified in South Africa. And that was one of the advantages of having a sophisticated laboratory network. Now, that was not only the NICD, it's a network throughout the country. The NIC was just one of the members. And they were able to kind of coordinate all these other laboratories and notify the World Health Organization and the world in general of these two variants, beta variant, and then after that, Omicron variant. But there have been many other kind of breakthroughs that have come from the NICD, which again I've detailed in the book.
Detailed in the book. That's great. That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. So I understand that to carry out these duties and responsibilities and to achieve all these things that you are telling me, you definitely need to have abundance of funds, like very huge funds in order to pay and foot the bill for everything that you're talking about. So do you often receive funding or enough funding to carry out your duties and responsibilities?
I can answer that in one word, no. But I think any research organization in the world, you ask that question, I think you're going to get that answer.
Okay.
No, obviously, this is one of the constraints. And I think this is one of the lessons we need to learn from COVID. There are three lessons. I'll come back to answer your question, but there are three lessons. One of them is funding for science, because we need to, for example, if you look at COVID, we need better vaccines. We need to orally administer the vaccine. We need vaccines against all the different subvariants. That's the one thing. We need community buy-in, as I mentioned earlier, community support and community buy-in. And we need the economic component as well to see that vaccines are distributed equitably throughout the world. Now, coming back to the science and the scientific research, no, there really isn't adequate funding. But of course, every kind of part of the economy of every country will fight for funds. And we need to motivate why an organization like the NICD and any other similar sister or brother organizations throughout the world needs to have adequate funds to do the research and to do the communication of that knowledge out into the public to get that public buy-in as well. So funds come for the NICD come predominantly from the government.
Okay.
That's the main source of funding.
Mm-hmm.
And that really funds the infrastructure. Then
Mm-hmm.
research funding comes from outside, from research grants. Some of it from inside the country. One of the offshoots of the Polio Research Foundation I mentioned earlier
Mm-hmm.
is that they sold a laboratory to the government, and that amount of money, they've got a board which consists of non-medical, non-scientific people, they're commercial people,
Mm-hmm.
financial people. They've invested it, and those funds are used for virology research, called the Polio Research Foundation. That's inside the country. We have a medical research council also inside the country. And then we also get funding from outside, from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, for example, provides quite a lot of funding. The Gates Foundation in the United States, the Wellcome Foundation in the United Kingdom. So various outside funding comes in that's for research. But yes, to answer your question, inadequate funding, but certainly we do get good funding, and that does supply good research coming out of the Institute.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. So now, you mentioned earlier on that, you have managed to achieve all that you have done, but in the face of hurdles, in the face of challenges that
Yeah.
sometimes
Yes.
slow down the work that you do, or that make you not be able to achieve things with the pace that you want or the extent that you want. What are some of these challenges that you have faced in executing your duties as an organization? Can your work at times find itself in the middle of politics and politicization and all that stuff?
We do. I think there are, if we go back to the early days of the Institute, in fact, when it was the NIV, National Institute for Virology, then it was under a government which at that stage it was the apartheid government, in fact, in those years, which was a very kind of paranoia. There's a lot of paranoia. To give you I'll give you some examples, and it's also in the book as well. One of the triumphs of public health has been the eradication of smallpox. You probably don't even know about smallpox. Can't see you're much younger than me, but smallpox was one of the scourges of yesteryear. In 1967, in fact, the WHO, World Health Organization, embarked on a campaign to eradicate smallpox, to wipe it completely off the planet, because we had an excellent vaccine and we had very good surveillance tools. And that campaign lasted about 11 years. And in 1977, the last patient in Somalia, in Africa, recovered from smallpox. And that was the last natural case of smallpox. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated from the planet. Now, the actual virus, the smallpox virus, of course, is now a very formidable virus because we don't vaccinate people anymore. And that's actually the number one biological agent, the biological weapon, in fact, because the world is now completely susceptible because you're no longer vaccinated. So if they were to introduce it, it would spread rapidly. So they agreed, the international community agreed that two laboratories would house it, the CDC in Atlanta and the Vector, which is a laboratory was then the Soviet Union, now is Russia. Those are only two laboratories still got the virus. But before that, there was a third laboratory which held the virus. NIV in South Africa. We were the last laboratory in the world to destroy the virus because the government in the day, because of its paranoia, it was involved in the war on the border with the Cuban Expeditionary Force, East Germany, which were vaccinating their troops, and they refused us to destroy that virus. That is one example of a clash, a direct clash. We nearly lost all our international contacts.
Wow.
We were grabbing on with our fingernails until eventually, with a lot of cajoling, a lot of threats, a lot of that we would walk out, in fact, they eventually allowed us to destroy that virus. Now there's only 2 laboratories are destroying it. But there were many bureaucratic hurdles. They refused us to attend international congresses, for example. All publications had to be gone through a censor mechanism.
Wow.
It was that kind of strict in those days. Then when we came to the democratic government from 1995 onwards, we had different problems. I mentioned about the AIDS denial, the HIV denial. That was also, it kind of embarrassed us internationally because it's got a lot of publicity that the African government with its HIV problem were refusing treatment, antiretroviral treatment. They would rather go for quack therapies or alternate medicine away from anti-science. This is also part of the HIV denial. And they actually forced us to do crazy experiments to kind of show that, in fact, HIV didn't exist. There's no such thing as the HIV virus. Fortunately, in 2008, the then President Mbeki, he retired. The Minister of Health at that stage retired. And then we got a new president, we got a new Minister of Health, and things got completely turned over. And now we got, in fact, a flagship antiretroviral program of the world. But that was just some of the illustrations of where academia and bureaucracy clash. And that's one of the difficulties.
That's very interesting, Dr. Barry Schoub. I'm very happy that you have managed to make that. We have obviously used a very good amount of time. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Barry Schoub. You can access a copy of his new book right by clicking the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Barry Schoub, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anotida. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful.